A group of leading nutrition scientists were the prominent authors of a state-of-the-art review in the prestigious Journal of American College of Cardiology. It was titled Saturated Fats and Health, a reassessment and proposal for food-based recommendations. This review found that government limits on saturated fats are not justified by the science. The article explains, quote, "The universal health effect of fats and oils depends on the content of saturated fatty acids and unsaturated fatty acids, but is not merely the sum of the effects of the individual lipid components. Rather, it depends on the interacting effects from naturally occurring components and from unhealthy compounds introduced by processing." It further asserts that the dietary recommendation to reduce the intake of saturated fatty acids without considering specific fatty acids in food sources is not aligned with the current evidence base. All guidelines should consider the type of fatty acids and, more importantly, the diverse foods containing saturated fatty acids, which may possess harmful, neutral, and even beneficial effects in relation to major health outcomes. So there you have it. Some may call it controversial, but that's not my opinion. Fat is not evil. Unprocessed fats were a part of our ancestral diet. Fat is necessary for survival. In fact, much of our brain is constructed from fatty acids. Our body does not naturally make fatty acids, so we have to get them from our diet. The fat in our body is always in flux, whether it's being stored or being used or converted to energy. In this webinar, I'll switch around talking about different types of fat. So to clarify, dietary fat is what we eat in our food. Circulating fat is what floats around in our blood. And the fat on our body is stored excess energy, but it's not the same thing as the fat we eat. So with the dietary guidelines of 2015 and 2020 that were just released, and maybe the American Association Diabetes Guidelines, why was it important to release another opinion? Well, the group of scientists stated that the basis of the dietary recommendations to limit saturated fats were 40 or 50 years ago, and they have important methodological flaws. And the human studies that assumed all foods in high saturated fats were similarly atherogenic were in most cases performed in an era prior to the recognition of the process contaminants of fats. Newer research shows that the amount of circulating saturated fatty acids in the blood is not related to the saturated fat intake from the diet, but instead tends to track more closely with dietary carbohydrate intake. In fact, since the low-fat revolution of the foods released in the 90s, a negative focus on total saturated fats has had the unintended effect of misleading, guiding governments, consumers, and the industry towards foods that are low in saturated fats, but more rich in refined sugars and starches. There can be two simplified points, if there can be a simplified point, that many goods have saturated fats, but other types of fats too. And many of the research articles actually talk about specific fatty acids in a variety of fats. The consensus is that you have your food choices with fats that need to be individualized and food specific. But when it's time to convene with your loved ones around the holiday or the picnic table, you will be serving foods, not different types of fatty acids. More importantly, you will serve foods every other day of the year, year-round. I'm going to proceed to explain the different types of fats. Healthy fats consist of polyunsaturated fats, which are found in this list here. Monounsaturated fats are mostly oils. Olive oil is the best because it's the least processed. These are also found in avocados, nuts, and seeds. Finally, the unsaturated fats can also be categorized into cis unsaturated fats, those that we eat from nature above, and trans unsaturated fats, which is the way we learn to synthesize fats in the industry. The trans fats were used to keep longer shelf lives of food, and they're actually what the government banned in 2018. So you won't see much more of them. Saturated fats are fatty acids that have hydrogens saturating all of the carbons. So this structure makes them very stable, and they have a very thick viscosity. They are also solid at room temperature, and they can last a long time, cook at higher temperatures, and provide texture that we like to eat. Saturated fat examples include this list right here. Jumping out of the research studies and into real life, the closest we ever get to eating a fat is with the use of cooking oils. But even here, we do not always eat saturated or unsaturated fats. Oils are all mixes of various fatty acids. None is one variety of fat in total isolation. For instance, olive oil, famously high in monounsaturated fats, but more than 20% of other variety fats are also included, and some are saturated. There are 4 universally good fats: salmon, nuts and seeds, avocados, and olive oil. And you can easily remember that there are 4, and good is a 4-letter word. These are fats that are the good cholesterol that protects your heart and your vessels from disease. The article from the Journal of American Cardiology Council also addresses foods that have past been taboo. Among the list are eggs, milk, red meat, and my personal favorite, dark chocolate. It's true that eggs can be a significant contributor to total saturated fatty acid intake. However, eggs can still be recommended because they're also nutrient dense and they provide important nutrients that are not widely available in other foods. For another is dairy. Dairy is perhaps the most major source of saturated fatty acids in most diets, and major dietary guidelines in the past have recommended low-fat and fat-free versions of dairy foods. Now, whole-fat dairies can actually be recommended, although they're rich in saturated fats, because they also play an important role in meeting dairy and nutritional recommendations. Often they have probiotics and bacterially produced bioactive peptides, short-chain fatty acids, and vitamins such as vitamin K2. Red meat was another among the list. Although the intake of processed meat has been associated with increased risk of heart disease, the intake of unprocessed red meat is not. So that indicates that the saturated fatty acid content of meat is unlikely to be responsible for this association. Processed red meats are things like hot dogs, bacon, and bologna. And finally, my favorite, dark chocolate, it also made the list. The council states that dark chocolate contains stearic acid, which has a neutral effect on cardiovascular disease risk. Chocolate actually contains nutrients that have been shown to be beneficial in type 2 diabetes. Other than the saturated fatty acids, it also has potential antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, and antithrombotic properties to it. The last part of the webinar is going to kind of connect fat and diabetes for you. Cardiovascular disease markers are almost as important to discuss as diabetes in this webinar because cardiovascular disease is the #1 cause of death in people with diabetes. Some research over the last 2 decades has actually shifted towards the identification of genetic factors underlying in the inter-individual differences and the response to dietary fatty acids. The information emerging from these studies suggests that there are genetic variants that may modulate the relationship between dietary saturated fats and cardiovascular disease biomarkers. One example of this is the APOE4 gene allele. Now, to discuss a little bit how fat affects blood sugar management. You may be surprised to hear that despite being more calories, fat actually stimulates insulin less than carbohydrates or protein. Fat from food actually does not require insulin because fat cannot be converted to blood sugar. However, again, we're going to talk about the mixed meal, kind of like we did in the protein series. High fat intakes with carbohydrates in a mixed meal has been shown to elevate and prolong post-meal glucoses. And that is for two reasons. Fat consumed in food will impair insulin sensitivity and delay the emptying of the stomach with the food. Research has shown that there's a vast difference in the two effects from person to person with diabetes. Most of the studies can support that high-fat meals over 40 grams should consider additional mealtime insulin to be delivered in a later wave, maybe over an hour or 2 hours later, but not at the pre-meal insulin dosing. And maybe increases in insulin doses for high-fat meals need to actually just be individualized. Here's an example. If you're eating a cucumber tomato salad with lots of vinegar and oil, then the delay in your blood sugar rise can be expected. But if you're eating a regular dessert or a potato with your steak, then the slow digestion is not going to prevent that blood sugar rise. So here are the takeaways. The fat you eat is not the fat on your body. The fat you eat does not always equal the fat in your blood. All fat is not bad. Trans fat is definitely bad. Processed fat is bad. But fat intake and what is ideal depends on your body composition and your biological composition. It can always be a safe bet to maximize healthy plant-based fats and salmon. And all in all, you should definitely avoid the refined, processed carbohydrates because those studies have been shown to increase the risk for heart disease. Here's a list of the healthy fats just as an end review. I do offer individual counseling for diet plans, and if you're interested, please visit the Evolve Diabetes website. And thank you for attending this webinar.